science enthusiasts. My name is Jason Zakowski. I'm a high school chemistry teacher and a science communicator, but I'm also the dog dad of Bunsen and Beaker, the science dogs on social media. If you love science and you love pets, you've come to the right place. Put on your lab coat, put on your safety glasses, and hold on to your tail. This is the Science Podcast. Hello, everybody. We hope you're happy and healthy out there. The day that I'm recording this message is April 8th, and Bunsen's birthday was yesterday. And oh my goodness, the outpouring of love from everybody on Twitter was actually overwhelming. Bunsen was trending number 10 in the United States on Twitter for a brief time, in about an hour on Saturday. And I just want to thank everybody for wishing Bunsen a happy birthday. I guess it just goes to show how much he means to everybody, which is really sweet. We had some really special stuff to announce also on his birthday, and I'll just quickly go over it now at the start of the Science Podcast at our website, and you'll find the link in the show notes. We've done a website revamp, and we're really proud to announce the Bunsen Stuffie 2.0. We've sold out about a year ago of Bunsen Stuffie 1.0, and for about a year, Chris and I have been developing the second Stuffie, and it is like chef's kiss. It is so adorable and so big. We're just really proud of it. And the other thing we're announcing also is the pre-sale of texts from Bunsen. If you are not on Twitter and you listen to our podcast on other platforms, you may not know what text from Bunsen is, but it's something that I come up with every week where Bunsen texts the family, and it's a back and forth that's funny and wholesome. And people have been asking for years for a text from Bunsen book. Making a book is easier said than done. And Chris and I have decided to go rogue and self-publish. And we are going to be taking pre-orders for text from Bunsen that will be bundled with the Bunsen Stuffie 2.0. So that's really exciting news. Bunsen had, if you're wondering about how Bunsen's birthday was, it was very low key. He lounged around the house. He got a cupcake and went for an awesome walk. That's a great birthday for a dog. All right, what's on the podcast this week? In science news, we're going to look at a study that found a link between sunscreen and the destruction or danger to coral reefs. You may find it hard to believe, but there is a connection between coral reef destruction or coral reef health and the amount of sunscreen in the water. Weird, hey? In Pet Science, I have a really fun news story about a potential dog allergen vaccine. So everybody's been following me being able to be around Ginger, a cat, and get over my allergies based on the food that she's on. Well, there could be hope on the horizon for those of you who are really allergic to dogs. Our expert guest this week is Dr. Katie Strang, who's a paleontologist with some expertise in geology too. It's gonna rock. Hey dogs, what do you call a dinosaur after a breakup? A Tyrannosaurus X. Okay, on with the show. Because there's no time like science time. This week in science news, let's talk about coral reef health and sunscreen. This science story caught my eye because it hit home to something that happened to me, my family, when we were at my brother's wedding many years ago, a while ago, actually, when Adam was little, like 4 or 5, and Duncan would have been 10 or 11. Anyways, my brother got married in Mexico to Erin, my sister-in-law. It was a destination wedding. It was beautiful. I had never been to Mexico before. It was like at a resort. So obviously it's not real Mexico. It's like resorty Mexico. It was so hot and so tropical. It was the first time I experienced anything like that ever. And one of the excursions that we went on was snorkeling in this cove. And this was the thing that basically created my love for the ocean, because up until this point, my experience with the ocean was almost non-existent. I grew up in Alberta, which is a prairie province. It's like the flyover states in the United States, super landlocked. And I was a competitive swimmer. I'm a very good swimmer. And this was the first time that being in a body of water was so interesting. putting on a snorkel. It was the first time I ever went snorkeling, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. All the fish and the sea urchins and the tropicalness of it. It was life-changing. And it was tough because I just got addicted, and like Adam wasn't a great swimmer. He was a little guy, so he had these little wings on, so Chris and I would just take turns staying above the water with him. But it was really tough because I wanted to be way down in the ocean looking at all the stuff. And one of the things that caught the reason why I'm telling you the story is we were given special sunscreen to wear when we got there because the guide told us that our sunscreen would hurt the coral. And I was like, really? Do you think it will? Like the ocean's so big, and like having your body with a little bit of sunscreen on it, would it really hurt the ocean? Well, turns out maybe. So this study comes from a group of scientists that looked at a special type of sea anemone. Now, to break down why sunscreen is bad for coral, we have to look at some creatures in the coral reef that live in symbiosis. And symbiosis is organisms living closely together. And in school, like in high school, we teach some are living together and they both benefit. Some they live together and one benefits and the other is hurt. That's parasitism. And sometimes they just live together. One benefits and the other's kind of meh to the whole arrangement. But the creatures we're talking about are sea anemones, mushroom coral, and a special type of algae. So sea anemones that take in sunscreen, which contains a chemical called oxybenzone. That's one of the things in sunscreen that protects you against UV light if you slather it on, into a toxin that is activated by light. Now, this would be very bad, except that algae that I spoke about, that kind of lives together with the anemone and mushroom coral, it soaks up the toxin. So in the recent issue of Science, they looked at a specific type of anemone and the fact that climate change is taking away that algae. As reefs heat up due to the warming of the ocean, they can actually eject that algae off, and then there's not that kind of buffering effect to this dangerous toxin that's broken down and activated by light. So in this new study from Stanford University, the scientists exposed this special type of anemone called glass anemone to oxybenzone, but also bright UV light and also some sugar. So what they found was that the oxybenzone plus the sugar became a toxin that was activated by light. Okay, so let's break down what happened in the study. A couple things. In one part of it, they exposed anemones to oxybenzone or fake light, not both at the same time. And another group of anemones were exposed to oxybenzone and fake light. So they had that oxybenzone chemical that could be broken down into something toxic. The group that was either exposed to oxybenzone or fake light, not both, survived the length of the study, which was 21 days. The group of anemones that were exposed to the water that contained the chemical and then were subjected to UV light, they all died within 18 days. So you have one group that survived, all of them, and another group where they all died over time. It wasn't right away, but it happened over time, which makes sense because it would take a bit of time for the anemones to metabolize that chemical into a toxin that would wipe them out. A second part of the study is they looked at how much of a protective effect that the algal symbiosis had on the survivability or the overall health of the anemone. And the algae seemed to protect the anemones, but more importantly than that was the second big study, which was with mushroom coral. They had a group that was exposed to UV light and oxybenzone, but they also introduced that special algae, and that special algae over 8 days kept the mushroom coral from dying or having negative health impacts. And the group that didn't have the algal friends had significant health issues, growth issues, die off. So I like this study because it gives you just a bit of pause before you go for a swim. Maybe we should be looking at sunscreen that doesn't have this oxybenzone, or before you go in the water, if you're only going for a little bit, having a shower and washing it off your body. It's pretty unclear what levels of it become dangerous to the coral, but they've proved pretty conclusively in the lab that it is dangerous for coral and it is dangerous for the anemones, which means that it's probably dangerous for lots of stuff that lives together in that really, really special ecosystem. That's science news for this week. This week in Pet Science, we're talking about a potential dog vaccine for allergens, or a human vaccine for allergens for dogs. I'm not sure how you're supposed to say it. Hopefully everybody's been following along that I'm having a great time with Ginger. She can sit right by my face and I don't have any allergy problems. And it all has to do, I think, with her food. So you better believe when I saw this come up on my news feed, potential dog allergen vaccine, I was a little interested. I was like, there's probably some people out there that are quite allergic to dogs that would love to have one, but they get murdered by their own body, which is what happened to me with cats for the longest time. So there's been lots of research into what is it that makes people allergic to dogs, but not a lot of practical research into how we could potentially use what we know as a vaccine. So this study comes from the Federation of European Biochemical Societies journal. Okay, that's a mouthful. So the allergens that are the most common ones that cause some kind of like histamine reaction or an immune response in humans, they're well known. There's 7 of them, and they have kind of a fancy name. Like, remember the FeLD1 protein from cats? These are called CAN-F1 through 7 for Canis familiaris. Now, well, all 7, I guess, are pretty big culprits for allergens. There's just one that is the top dog. Just like FeLD1 in cats, there is one that's really, really the one that causes most people's issues with dogs and allergies, and it is called CAN-F1. Instead of FeLD1, it's CAN-F1. Something like 50 to 75% of the immune response / allergy response comes from this one single molecule. Up until this point, researchers couldn't figure out where CAN-F1's epitones were. And to kind of sum up what an epitome is with a little bit of molecular biology, epitones are the things that bind to antigens on the surface of our immune system stuff, like antibodies and T cells and things like that. So it's the lock to the key that sets the whole immune response into action, these epitomes. So it isn't well known how it connects to antigens that are then recognized by all of the stuff in our body and says intruder until this study using X-ray crystallography, which is a fancy way of shooting X-rays at a material to see what it looks like. This team was able to determine the structure of the CAN-F1 protein. And this is the first time ever. So that's why this is a big deal. We didn't know before, but we know now. So the whole idea of now understanding what this looks like is that a vaccine could be developed. You want to give folks really small doses of the epitomes so the immune system is trained to deal with it, similar to a virus. So now that scientists have isolated the thing that starts the immune response to these allergens in motion, that's what the vaccine could be then built upon. Now, this is the first step. This is like the first layer of a brick wall. It's building the foundation. We're not there yet, but with luck, this scientific breakthrough could build a vaccine for those humans that are so allergic to dogs. It's like living in hay fever season 24/7. I'd like to say I never thought I would be living with a cat because I was so allergic. So go science. There's hope out there for everybody. That's Pet Science for this week. Hey everybody, before we get to the interview section, I thought I would just give you some ideas about how you could support the Science Podcast. Number 1, you could support us on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/BunsonBurner. There's multiple tiers of support, and the lowest tier of support is not much more than a cup of coffee a month. The second way is you could check out our merch shop. We've worked really hard to partner with clothing companies that do a great job of providing vibrant colors and soft feels. We also have the Beaker Stuffie for sale. It's so cute. The third way you could support us is giving us great reviews on our podcast playing apps. Any kind of review helps. And if you can't find a review, share our podcast with people. Thanks, everybody. It's time for Ask an Expert on the Science Podcast, and I am thrilled to have Dr. Katie Strang, paleontologist and geologist, with us today. How are you doing, Katie?
Hello, I am good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on the show. Very excited to talk to you today.
Oh, yay. Well, I'm excited to talk to you, so that makes two of us. Excited squared.
Awesome.
Where are you calling into the podcast from? Where are you in the world?
So I am in Scotland in a little place called Fife, which is on the east coast of Scotland.
Now, I can tell by your accent that you're definitely from Scotland. But have you lived there your whole life, or did you move around? Are you one of the globetrotter people?
I'm not really a globetrotter. When I was very wee, my parents moved over to New Zealand. So my little brother was born over in New Zealand, lived there for a couple of years before moving back to Scotland. And the only other place I've really lived is England. So I did my PhD down in England.
Oh, right. So we'll get into that, I guess. I'm just so curious. Everybody, I don't know if you know this when you talk to people, but almost 100% of people in the world love the Scottish accent. It's just so amazing.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a weird one because I've lived all across Scotland. So, it's a bit mixed. So people don't always know where I'm from in Scotland.
Oh, the Scots don't know where you're from in Scotland. Is that how it goes? That's funny. Well, in Canada, you can tell usually who's from the East Coast because they have a little bit of a different Canadian accent to the people from the west side of Canada. That's dialect so funny. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about you, Katie. You are a paleontologist / geologist. How did you get into that? What's your, and you're a doctor, you're Dr. Katie Strang, I should say. How did you get that? What's going on with your education there?
So it was a bit of a untraditional route in the sense that when I was in high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do as an adult. But when I went to uni, I did English literature for 2 years before I sort of realised that wasn't the path I wanted to go on. And I had met a friend who was also at uni studying archaeology, and that happened to be in the same building as the geology department. And I realised that that's what I wanted to do. So I did my degree over in Glasgow, and that was in earth sciences, which covers a very sort of broad range of geology topics, including paleontology. Okay. And then I did my master's after that as well. And my master's was at Glasgow as well, and that was in evolutionary biology because I realised I really loved fossils, but I wanted to get that kind of biology perspective to what I was doing rather than just the pure geology side of things. Mm-hmm. And then, after that, it took me on to my PhD, which was at Durham University down in the northeast of England.
Right.
And stayed there for 4 years.
Were you somebody when you were young that you were like, was science your jam when you were like little Dr. Katie Strang? Were you looking at rocks and picking up stuff and loved fossils and dinosaurs and things like that?
Definitely. And I think one of the reasons that I didn't really figure that out till I was older is I never really saw any scientists that kind of looked like me. So I was always a bit disconnected, I felt. But where I grew up was in the Scottish borders, only about 2 or 3 miles from the border with England. And some of the rocks there are some of the most important for early Carboniferous fossils and when animals first moved from the sea onto the land. So the rocks there are very special, and I kind of always knew that growing up, and I would find fossils as a kid. But as I got older, I disconnected from it for a little bit before getting back into it.
What was the thing that made you reconnect? Was it just becoming close, like more mature? You went through like a teenage phase? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not really sure myself. I think just sort of realizing that not having to do things to please other people or meet other people's expectations. And because I've always liked sort of tattoos and piercings and stuff, I've never really looked like a typical scientist to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I think it was just getting more confident as I got older and realizing, that is what I want to do. And it doesn't matter what other people think. So, and I just really, really love rocks. So,
well, rocks rock, right?
For sure.
So now that you're done your PhD, what areas of paleontology are you studying? Or is it a continuation from your PhD studies or something new?
It's actually something new, and it sort of developed over lockdown because I couldn't go anywhere else. And where I live is in a wee village, and it's surrounded by limestone. So I got really into going around and having a look at the different types of species that I could find, but in particular shark teeth. So one of my main interests at the moment is looking for the different types of sharks that were alive during this time and trying to work out what was going on with the ecosystems, which is quite exciting. But I also have quite a few other sort of research interests. Another one is one that always people give me weird looks when I say this, but I really, really love coprolites, which is fossilized poo, or as we call it in Scotland, jobby. So jobby is a Scots word for poo. So if you ever hear me talking about fossil jobbies, that's what I'm referring to. So yeah, I've been collecting a lot of samples from different parts of Fife and trying to use the coprolites to look at the ecosystems at the time. So in places where there's not a lot of actual body fossils preserved, so like the fossils of fish and sharks and things, you can actually look at the different coprolites and start to categorize them and get an idea of what was living and what was eating what. Which is pretty exciting.
So you do the two things combine, like looking for shark teeth and these coprolites? Like, does one help the other, or are they different?
They're slightly different. So the shark teeth that I find round about where I live are from a marine rock. So they were living in shallow tropical seas. So the environment, the reason I'm particularly interested in this time period, we're going back to about 330 million years ago.
Whoa.
Yeah. So it's really cool to think that at that point, Scotland was actually lying near to the equator and would have had a really hot and humid and tropical climate, very unlike what it is at the moment. And back then there was sort of periods where there was sea level rise, and that made sort of shallow tropical seas that had big coral reefs. And in amongst these coral reefs, you had all sorts of types of fish and sharks that were swimming about there and interacting with these reef environments, which I always think is really cool when you think to now. And places like the Great Barrier Reef, you can use those sort of as an analogy almost to think about how diverse life would have been back in that time period.
Right. And like in your little village of Fife, way back when was under the ocean or the sea, potentially.
And there was also around about the same time a lake in Scotland called Lake Cadell, or Loch Cadell if you're Scottish. And that was a big freshwater lake that had lots of really sort of important environments in it that preserved some of the best fossils in Scotland. So it's lots of really exciting rocks, because like Scotland's quite a small country, so you don't always really expect it to be like that diverse in its geology, but we're very lucky that we have some of the oldest rocks in the world, and we also have like the Central Belt, which is full of these Carboniferous rocks.
Wow. You know, there's a lot of parallels between Scotland and Alberta for fossils. Because like we have near the mountains, we have like this huge amount of rock of like ancient organisms. And then the down south that we have the Tyrrell Museum, which has all of the giant dinosaurs that lived around that time. It just seems I hear that all the time, that there's a lot of similarities in little places around the world that are like hotspots for fossils, and Scotland's one of them.
Yeah, and sort of that connection with like the North American continent and everything in Scotland. You know, we were once part of the same big supercontinent, which one of the ways that we can determine that is by looking at the fossils and their similarities between different places today. So it's a really important thing that scientists use, you know, to look at this evidence and work out how the continents and the land masses have moved over time.
Right. Same kind of like dinosaur, whatever, shark lived, died, became a fossil, and then over millions of years kind of got drifted apart as the continents separated. Like, that's crazy. That's bananas.
I know. And it's one of those things that no matter how many fossils I look at or how many times I go fossil hunting, I still get excited like every time.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I love it.
And
do you ever shout out with like excitement? Like, do you Or do you just get a little heart palpitation? Like what happens when you find one? Like
Yeah.
what's your emotional
I'm
response?
one of those people that will, I can't really contain my excitement. So I do tend to jump about quite a lot and wave my arms a lot. And
Aw.
yeah, I've got, when I go fossil hunting with some of my friends, they're much the same, but sometimes you'll hear them like shriek in the distance and you're like, oh no, like, are they okay? And then you realize that they've just found something really cool and they're just being excited. So it's always really great fun. And we're sort of one of the things that I also do is sort of on a voluntary basis is with the Scottish Geology Trust, just talking about Scottish geology. So I'm secretary and trustee, and one of the things we do is try and just promote how awesome Scotland's like rocks and stuff are. And
cool.
get that story out to people who wouldn't necessarily have a reason to get into geology or paleontology, and try and reach and engage people with their landscapes. Because I think a lot of people, when they think of Scotland, one of the first things that comes to their head is the amazing landscapes, particularly, in the Highlands of Scotland, and very iconic. And a lot of people don't realise that that's related to the geology. So it's nice to try and tell that story to people.
That and Outlander, probably. Those two things probably right now people think about of Scotland.
Yeah, Outlander was actually part of it filmed in Cuteness, which is a little village just a few miles along the coast of the Forth from me. So,
oh, really?
Yeah,
that's so cool.
You get lots of tourists there with reenactments and stuff going on. It's pretty cool.
My wife and I are big fans of that show. I don't want to turn this into an Outlander talk, but I know if you ask the average person now, that's something that comes to mind about Scotland just because of the popularity of that huge show.
I know it's quite funny because I've still not actually got around to watching it myself. So all I know is from like the post that I see from along the village.
Okay, one more follow-up question before we move on. From what you've been looking at, the coprolites, the shark teeth, have you found anything? Have you been able to make a conclusion? Or maybe a hypothesis about what was going on back then?
So one of the things with the shark teeth is that the particular deposit of limestone that I've been looking at, it hasn't really been studied in great detail for its paleontology. And that's just because it's actually on private land, and it was quarried for, the limestone was quarried to be used for lime mortar, which is another thing I'm interested in, but we can go on to that. Because there's not been much study at the moment, the most important thing is trying to make a record of all these different species. So far, we're at 14 different species of shark that haven't been written about previously here. So that's the first thing that we'll be doing, is trying to get that written up. And with the coprolites, the first thing I was doing there is actually try and look at the sediment, so understand the rocks that they're in, to understand the environment a bit more. And I've also just had some samples prepared so that I can look at some of these coprolites under a microscope, which I'm very excited about.
Wow, that's cool. That's exciting. I have to ask one more follow-up question. When you look at the coprolites underneath the microscope, like, can you see the stuff they ate, like little bones or whatever?
Yeah, this is
like, how does is that because we're thinking about fish poop? Maybe they were predatory. I don't know. Is that a dumb question?
No, not at all. It's actually one of the sort of features that you look for to identify it as a coprolite. So you won't always be able to see what it ate, but the site that I'm looking at, you see lots of bits of fish bone and bits of scale in there, and also sometimes bits of plant material. So if you find plant material, you know that it was probably a herbivore.
Right.
And you can use that kind of information to categorize them into, so you're never likely to actually find the animal or the species that made that jobby, but you can use that information to get like a bigger picture of the sort of variety or diversity of animals that were alive then. But yeah, you can, like, one of the things that I want to do is get them CT scanned, micro CT scan, to actually see if there's any complete bones inside some of them, because they can get quite big, up to about sort of 12 centimeters.
Okay, yeah.
So that's quite a big poo, which was probably made by a fish like a rhizodont, which were big predators in the Carboniferous. They could grow up to sort of 6 or 7 meters in length.
What?
They were really gnarly. They had...
That's huge.
Yeah, like ginormous. And they would have been like pretty... well, I don't think you would want to be in the water with those around, because their teeth...
Oh my,
Like,
that's like as big as my classroom, Katie.
yeah.
That's like as
I know
uh,
it's mad, and they've actually found not just like the teeth of these, because they were fish. They actually had bony skeletons. So there's places where you found rhizodont skulls in other parts of the body. So that's how we get another picture as
what?
well of how big they are. Because
That's so
yeah,
cool.
it's really awesome. And their teeth are super sharp, like what you would kind of call tusk teeth, and that they're really pointy, which meant they were very good for eating other fish and sharks as well.
Man, can you imagine seeing that while you were snorkeling? Like that would be some sketchy stuff happening right
I
there.
know, and
I'd be
yeah,
because it's bigger than that's bigger than sharks. Like they would eat sharks, right? Unless they were like the giant sharks of ancient time.
yeah. Well, these were mostly freshwater, so they would have been eating freshwater sharks.
They're
Yeah,
freshwater. They're in a lake.
yeah.
What?
I know.
This is wild. I'm sorry I'm interrupting you. I'm so sorry. I'll be quiet,
No,
but
no,
I'm
not
just
at all. I
stunned.
get very excited about them as well. And some of the teeth like could get absolutely huge. I know in the National Museum of Scotland they have some in their collections, and some of the tusk teeth were, you're talking sort of like 20 centimeters at least. And a lot of those were found when we were mining for coal in Scotland. So a lot of the rocks that are associated with coal seams are from these freshwater environments where you find all these cool fossils and stuff.
Like trees fell into the water, became coal, and of course the fossils of these guys were there too.
Yeah, so there would have been sort of big coal forests around at the time of the rhizodont swimming about in the freshwater systems. So it would have been, quite a diverse landscape.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love thinking about it. It'd be really cool if you could actually like go back in time to the Carboniferous. It's one of my dreams, just to go and like see. But it'd probably be quite scary because things got really big as well in the Carboniferous. So
yeah, I think you and I would be murdered in like 5 seconds by something if we went back in time, but it would be a glorious 5 seconds.
Definitely.
Oh man, I have so many other questions just about the rhizodon, but I think we have to move on. Is that okay, Katie?
Yeah, of course.
The other thing you work and you study on is lime mortar. Did I get that right? And graveyard geology?
Yeah.
Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I'll start with the lime mortar side of things. So
okay.
depending on where you are in the world, you may be very familiar with it, or you may have never heard of it at all. So what lime mortar is basically used as a building material instead of cement. So before we manufactured cement, most commonly limestone was burned locally. And when you burn limestone, you remove all the carbon dioxide from it, and it becomes something called calcium oxide, which is a very reactive substance known as quicklime. And when you add water to it, it creates an exothermic reaction.
I love that reaction. I show that to the kids.
It's so cool, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's such a violent reaction as well. And what we did in Scotland historically when we were making buildings is you would mix up your lime hot on site. So you would have the quicklime and just add water and sand to it. And that would make your building material, your mortar, to put in between the stones in your house. And more recently, there's kind of been a revival in this kind of traditional use of building materials, because after the war, a lot of places had to be rebuilt very, very quickly, and cement just took over as a building material because it sets very quickly, it's hard, it's relatively cheap, but at the same time, it's incredibly bad for a lot of Scotland's old buildings. So part of the work that I do is looking at these old buildings that have been at some point rendered with cement, which means they've had cement applied on the outside. And what that does is it actually destroys the stone underneath. So part of what I'm interested in is working out how they were making these old materials, but how we can best replicate those now to try and preserve all the old traditional buildings that we have in Scotland.
So this lime material doesn't eat up the rocks, like it doesn't dissolve the rocks to corrode the rocks like cement does, or whatever cement does.
So the big difference between the two is that cement, because it is so strong and because we add a lot of things to cement to make it set so hard, it's very impermeable, which means no water can get inside of it. So if you put that on a building, and a lot of our buildings where I am in Scotland are made out of soft sandstone, and sandstone is a rock that has a lot of pore space. So most of the oil that is extracted in the North Sea comes out of sandstone reservoirs because it has the capacity to just hold a lot of material, whether it's liquid or gas. And in a building, if you have a cement in between your stone, it means all your water gets stuck in your stone. And that causes all sorts of problems with grains falling off, and bits of your building start to decay and drop off, which is the last thing that you want. It's usually better to sort of fix these things before they get bad.
It sounds like it solved the problem, but created a long-term one. Like it was a short-term solution, long-term problem kind of deal.
Yeah, and it's quite relevant in a lot of places today because of climate change. So in Scotland, one of the effects that we're facing with climate change is increased rainfall and extreme weather conditions. So when you're having that, particularly in buildings that are already quite exposed, say along the coast, how do we then protect those going forward and protect them for future generations? Because a lot of our buildings in Scotland, we're quite lucky that a lot of our old little towns, villages, even our cities like Edinburgh, have some incredible historic buildings there. So it's, how do we best preserve those for future generations and people to enjoy and to live in?
It blows my mind talking to people from other parts of the world and how their buildings are constructed.
Yeah.
Because zero houses where I live are made out of stone. Zero. Like they're all made of wood because Alberta's, and Canada is covered in forest. Yeah. Well, with the exception of Eastern Canada with the Canadian Shield. I don't know what they do over there. Maybe they use rock, but it's still covered in forest underneath the rock or on top of the rock. It just blows my mind. Your house is made of sandstone. Like that's wild to me.
Yeah, and it's really, that's another thing that I'm really, really interested in is how people connect to their building materials, but also their local resources, because you see in Scotland that when the railway came into play, that a lot of the building materials changed. So you wouldn't be using local stone. You would bring stone from other parts of the UK or even from abroad. And it totally changed the style and the aesthetic of the buildings. And it's really interesting how people have that connection to where they live because of their environment around them, whether it be, brick houses or houses built from wood or stone houses. It's really fascinating to me.
We see like the really romantic houses in Alberta are the log cabins. Like they're made of logs and they look really, really cool. Yeah. And they're very, very sweet looking houses. Not a lot of people have them anymore, but we're very attached to the log cabin type house.
Yeah, I can totally see why though, because I think when I think of sort of remote Canada and stuff, I do think of like a log cabin.
Yeah.
And I know that's probably really stereotypical, but it is one of those things, I guess, just from like the media and things that you get that sort of vibe.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, they're so beautiful. And just imagine having a really nice fire going and everything. It'd be like proper cozy.
Well, I think of castles when I think of England and Scotland. So there you go, right? So
we do have quite a lot, I guess.
Could you talk to us about the graveyard geology bit that you do? Because I have no idea what you're going to talk about, but I'm just excited to hear it.
So this is one that always gets a few weird looks as well, but it's something I got into when I was living in Glasgow. So because I didn't have a car and I couldn't really go away from the city, I realised that a really good place to look at geology was actually in the local graveyards. So I would just go around and they're usually very peaceful, particularly if you're in a busy town or city. If you go into the graveyard, they're usually quite quiet and quite calming. And that sort of started my interest, where you would look at the different materials, and some people, would have brought a marble from Italy. And that would tell you something about who those people were, their sort of status in society at the time. And I realised it was just quite a good way to connect people to their sort of urban geology and to their materials as well. So that kind of progressed into, I'm involved in quite a lot of community projects where we look at local cemeteries, and we don't only document the geology of the gravestones, but also the history of the people that are actually buried in those places, to try and preserve that for the local community and to understand more about these places. At Dunfermline, which is the town closest to me, there's Dunfermline Abbey, which is where Robert the Bruce is buried. And we've been doing work in the cemetery there to try and sort of understand the different people that were buried there. It's absolutely fascinating. So much history to be uncovered.
Well, what you study with archaeology and geology is just history of a different sort.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And it's always quite funny because when I'm speaking to the groups who were doing the more history, so the more recent side of things, to me, 1,000 years is really young. Even 100 million years to me is quite young as well. And it's always really, I think when you sort of speak to people from different disciplines and who have different expertise and different views, it's so great, and what you can achieve together by those different mindsets coming together. It's awesome.
Right. And then if you were to talk to an astrophysicist, they'd be like, 900 million years? Oh, come on. We're talking billions of years on my scale.
Yeah. And it's really cool. And one of the things with the graveyard geology that I do is try and do little trails so that people can either download them, or I do tours sometimes where people can come, and it's just a great way for people who might not necessarily be able to get out to the Highlands or to a remote part of Scotland to enjoy the geology, to come and actually learn a little bit about it in a kind of urban setting, which I always find really
right, because it's a bit of a drive to get out to the Highlands, probably from any kind of like major center in Scotland.
And I think, if people just having quite busy lives, they're not able to dedicate the time as much as they would want, and people are just quite interested to sort of learn how we changed on the types of materials we used, or why we used certain rocks for gravestones, because there's that kind of human element to it. So you get to engage with people who might not necessarily engage with just a pure geology chat, because it kind of brings that human element into it as well, which is a really good way to sort of diversify who you're reaching as an audience.
I love it. It's about making connections to the past and to science.
Yeah.
So cool.
And it suits my aesthetic quite well, because I'm a bit of a wee goth. So I like to go and sit and just sort of read and study in the cemetery. Not so much in winter time, but during the summer, I'm usually there quite a lot.
It's probably very peaceful and beautiful, though. Most cemeteries are.
Yeah, it really is. And it's a nice place to sit and just sort of reflect on things and, just sort of clear your head a bit. But again, it's the history that you're surrounded by is just pretty awesome.
That's made me ponder a bit. Any paleontologist I ask, I have to ask this question. And that is, what is your favorite dinosaur? Or do you not have one?
So this is a very difficult question. I'm probably going to go with Allosaurus, because Allosaurus has always kind of been one of my favorite dinosaurs. And Allosaurus was around during the late Jurassic. And was quite a large theropod dinosaur, which would have eaten like Stegosaurus and stuff. So really kind of gnarly dinosaurs. They were carnivores, big predators. And I recently got one tattooed on my arm. That's how much I like them.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So
actually, you know what? I think I saw that picture of yours on Instagram. That was your arm. Do you have a picture of it on Instagram?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I was doing background research on you, and I saw that, and I just remember seeing it.
Yeah, so. they're quite an iconic dinosaur as well, I suppose, because they're very well known. I think most people know what Allosaurus sort of looked like, with the little like crest-like horns on their head, and I just think they're really, really cool. But yeah, because I don't study dinosaurs, it's quite an interesting
right, I know.
question, because there's other ones that I was like, but maybe one that was sort of, particular to Scotland, or one that's been found here. But I would have to go with Allosaurus, I think, because it's always been my favorite. So
we have a couple standard questions we ask our guests on the podcast. And the first one is for a pet story. We ask our guests to share a pet story from their life. could you share a pet story with us?
Yeah, so I don't currently have my own pet at the moment, sadly, but my parents have a Labrador called Marley who they rescued, and he's about 9 years old now. And if you've ever met a Labrador, you'll know what they're like. They're just so happy. They just want to please you, and they literally want to eat everything. And
Yep.
one
Yep.
of my favourite things is when I go home to visit my parents, I'll take Marley out, but they live in a very small village where everyone knows everyone. And Marley's routine is now there's certain neighbours where you take him on a walk and he takes the lead in his mouth and he just trots into their house to get treats. You're just left there standing outside like, oh, he's just gone into someone's house. And he just trots back out again. And it's like, he's kind of like the neighbour's favourite animal. He just goes in like, hello, I'm your friend, so can I have some food here? And I just find it so adorable because most people it's quite, the first couple of times it happened, I was absolutely, I was so embarrassed because I was like, I'm so sorry. He just ran in because people just leave their door open and stuff. But more recently, he has discovered that one of the neighbours throws out rotting vegetables behind their garden, and his new favourite thing is to go and eat rotten Brussels sprouts.
Gross.
So yeah, I just love how sort of silly and excited they get about food. But obviously we try not to let him. He has to now go on the lead at that bit because otherwise he'll wait until you're quite far away and then he looks at you and he does that, that cheeky look that the dog gives where it's like, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then that's like, he's just off and he'll be smelling of Brussels sprouts for days to come. So
what a cute story. Yeah, we have that problem with Bunsen. He is such a good boy. But if you follow our account, he finds in the spring and sometimes the summer, like parts of animals that don't make the winter.
yeah.
And he does not listen with those. And he trots about with a moose leg or a deer leg. And it's pretty disgusting.
Yeah, it's the way they do it as well when they give you that look because they know they're not supposed to be doing it.
Yeah.
There's a field as well that a farmer grows carrots in this field. So whenever Marley goes in, he gets very excited because he digs up the carrots.
Oh,
and then he just runs about with like 4 or 5 carrots hanging out his mouth. So happy with himself. And you can't really chase him because I'm like, if I chase him, he might swallow one of those and like choke on a carrot. So he just kind of stands there and chomps them really happily and excitedly. And the farmer finds it hilarious though. So
oh, so the farmer's not upset.
No, he's like the dog's
watching the whole show.
Yeah, he's always happy for the dogs to take a few.
What a great pet story. Thanks for sharing that, Katie.
Pets are the best.
I love it. They are. The other standard question we ask our guests is for our guests to share a super fact with us and something that when you tell people, it kind of blows their mind. And my mind's been blown so many times this chat already. But do you have a super fact for us saved?
So one of my favorite ones is the sharks managed to survive all 5 mass extinction events. So
wow,
as an animal group, they're pretty resilient and are still going strong today, which I just find really incredible.
Is there something special about them? Like, is there some theories how they made it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different theories about it. We're still not really sure, but we think it's because sharks were very good at adapting to new environments because a lot of sharks that live today are able to go between, like deep waters and shallow waters and things. And that ability to be able to switch to a new environment would have really, really helped them. But also they're like super diverse as well. So the sharks from the Carboniferous that I look at, that time period is actually called the Golden Age of Sharks because of how much they diversified. And one of the reasons was because at the mass extinction event at the end Devonian, before this time period, so much of the ocean life went extinct that they had no real predators anymore. So because they didn't have these predators, they were able to exploit a lot of different parts of the environment that they weren't previously. And yeah, that just helped them sort of radiate as a species, which is a animal group, which is really, really cool.
They fit every niche in the ocean at that time. Like everywhere you could find a shark, there was a shark probably.
Yeah, and well, sort of compared to, we use like a lot of analogies of how modern sharks change in their environments and things to sort of model how these animals would behave. But yeah, definitely, just being able to be adaptable to change, because that's one of the big problems with when an animal goes extinct or a species goes extinct, just because there's maybe been some sort of environmental factor that they have not been able to adapt to. And yeah, it's one of those things, because people always think, like, I mean, the dinosaurs went extinct, but sharks, they managed to survive 5 of those extinction events and they're still here, which I just always find really cool.
They're the ultimate survivor.
Yeah, definitely.
So the last section of the podcast is a fun one. We get to know our guest a little bit outside of what they study, and get to know what they're passionate about. And you had a couple things you wanted to chat about. One was tattoos and metal gigs. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've always been really, really into tattoos, and it's quite a hard question because literally all my hobbies do really involve like rocks and fossils, but a lot of my tattoos are of different fossils or animals or other geeky subjects, but I've always kind of been a bit, I guess you'd say, alternative when it comes to appearance and what I sort of enjoy. And I've always sort of grown up a big fan of metal music. So whether it be sort of death metal or thrash metal, just lots of really heavy, chaotic music. I love stuff like that. And gigs have always been one of my absolute favourite pastimes. But sadly, because of COVID, I feel like, I've not been to a gig in about 2 years, which that's the longest I've sort of gone since I started going to gigs.
Okay, right. And for a gig, it's like a show, right? Like a band
so that's
show.
Just going to watch like a live band, and I like even just going to local shows as well, where you get to see local bands and just basically being in an environment where I always find it quite a welcoming community to go to those types of shows. People are always really welcoming and not judgmental, and everyone just has a really great time and looks out for each other, which I really enjoy.
Oh, nice. Hopefully this isn't too personal, but do you have a favorite tattoo?
No, that's not too personal at all. It kind of changes, I think. Most recently, I got the palm of my hand tattooed, and I got a cross-section through a nautilus shell, which is a type of cephalopod. And that's my current favourite, because on the other side of my hand, I have an actual nautilus. So it's kind of like when I switch my hand, I can go from like the actual drawing of it to show what the shell looked like inside, which I think is quite cool.
That is so cool. That is so cool. Is that like long range planning? Like, did you plan that, or did it just kind of happen?
Yeah, I'd had the idea in my head for absolutely ages, but I thought that I was like, maybe a really silly idea, and then I was like, you know what, I think it's cool, so I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm glad I did. So
that'd make for a great presentation if you're talking to kids. You could be like, hey, here's the nautilus, here's the shell.
I know.
You have the projector on your body.
Well, that's like, because my one of my sleeves on my arm is actually like the sort of dinosaurs and extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous. So it's a really, really good teaching aid, because I think kids sort of don't see me as like a typical adult. They kind of relate more and will open up, but it's always a really good icebreaker as well. But I'm very excited for the next time someone asks me about cephalopods or a nautilus, so I can wave my arm about at them.
That's so cool, Katie. Well, you're very brave. I don't have a single tattoo. I don't know. I need to find something that connects with me before I get one.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with me, it's like, I just love that kind of heavily tattooed appearance, but that's totally not for everyone's taste. And I think I'm one of those people that I'm quite impulsive. So usually my tattoos, some of them are very well planned, like my hand and stuff, but sometimes they are a bit random and just kind of, I quite fancy this. So Just depends on what sort of my mood is at the time.
The other thing you wanted to talk briefly about is, and this might be a good kind of like historical thing for people, is Scottish independence. Could you talk to us about that? What's going on with that?
So Scotland is a country, but we are not a fully independent country because even though we have our own government and parliament, they're just a devolved government, and we're part of the United Kingdom. So a lot of people who are outside of the UK sometimes think that we're one big country, but the UK is actually made up of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And Scotland had an independence referendum back in 2014, which was basically a referendum. And the question was, should Scotland be an independent country? And unfortunately, it didn't go the way I wanted, and the vote was no. But, that's democracy. That's, kind of you just get on with it. But it didn't stop me sort of being involved in politics. And I don't know how much other people have heard about the mess that is Brexit that's currently going on within the United Kingdom, but we had another referendum to leave the European Union where Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain part of the European Union, but England voted to leave. And because we're not independent, we have no say over this. So we've literally had to leave the European Union sort of against the will of Scotland as a country, which, it has all sorts of repercussions on things like funding for science that comes from the EU, things like this that, it's very bizarre because in Scotland, because we all voted for the EU, we're like, can we not just stay in? Because, please, do we have to go with you? But it's one of those things that I think it depends on how you've sort of been grown up and how involved you've been with politics. But it's something that I feel quite strongly about, mostly through just seeing these changes where we've been made as a country to do stuff that we've not voted for, which it's never fun when you end up with a government that your country voted completely against. So...
Yeah, I remember that was a big deal. That made Canadian news, actually, that Scotland, I forget the percentage, but it was like a huge majority didn't want to leave the EU, and then I think it squeaked by in the rest of UK. Like it wasn't like overwhelming everywhere else, and you guys had to go, and that's kind of awful. So. I know I like learning more about what's happening in the rest of the world.
Yeah, definitely. And I always find it amazing how little you see about other countries and other places and their politics. I mean, we don't really get much in the way of Canadian news. We get loads about America. Yeah, but aside from that, you have to actually go and do sort of your own research and learn about it. But it's absolutely fascinating learning about the history of countries, like sort of the declaration that joined Scotland and England together happened, in the 1700s. It was a long, long time ago. So the argument that was done all those hundreds of years ago doesn't really stand because people today are like, well, this is a sort of modern society where we should be allowed to vote again. So it's interesting times.
Well, thanks for talking to us about at least, something that maybe our listeners, if they're not from Scotland, have no idea about, and then your opinion on that. I appreciate that. Plus also talking about tattoos that will resonate with a lot of our listeners.
Definitely. And I always love seeing other people's tattoo concepts and hearing about why people get tattooed and why they got a particular tattoo. It's always really fascinating.
Well, we're at the end of the chat, Katie. Thank you so much for talking to us today. This has been an amazing conversation. I just got so wrapped up into you talking about the that ancient fish. I'm going to be thinking about it for like weeks with it's a 7-meter long thing and its giant teeth and it's super sketchy business. And also Coprolites. And that was cool, making poo cool.
I know. I always say someone has to love fossil poo. So,
can people follow you somewhere on social media?
Yeah, I've got a Twitter account which is Palaeokatie, And I also have a fossil page on Instagram, which is just called Scottish Fossils.
Yeah, if you have Instagram, check that out, people. I've been like, last night I was like scrolling through it, and it's just picture after picture of amazing fossils. Like, very cool.
And, I like to post lots of pictures on Twitter as well of like fossil poo and things. So lots of entertainment. No, thank you very much for letting me come along and talk. I always love to talk about rocks and fossils. Makes me very happy.
Yay!
Okay, it's time for story time with me, Adam. If you don't know what story time is when we talk about stories that have happened within the past 1 or 2 weeks. I will start. You know, having Ginger's been amazing. It's been so great. I love having a cat because you can just pick her up and then she's pick-upable. Beaker's pick-upable, but it's nothing like the cat. But when we get home, the dogs go mental. They go crazy because they haven't seen us all day. But something that I've noticed is that the cat is actually excited to see us. Sometimes it's because she's getting fed. And although she can be sort of tricksy sometimes with being fed, like you'll get home and she would already have been fed, and she'll trick you into thinking that she hasn't been fed ever in her life. Yeah, she'll start meowing at you. But no, she's excited to see us when we get home. Like, she'll stand up on the banister looking all proud because she's a cat and she thinks she's a god. But yeah, she is excited to see us. And that's something that I was super surprised about because I thought it was just like dogs who were excited to see us and cats just didn't really care. But no, she cares and she's excited to see us and she loves us. So that was pretty wholesome to find out. Dad, do you have a story?
You bet I do. So my story is about Beaker Girl. I was going to take the two dogs for a walk, and Chris was really busy. I'm not sure what she was doing. She was super busy, and she couldn't come on the walk. So for the longest time, Chris has actually been coming on the walk with me. I'd say for like an entire year almost. Whereas before that, I would almost always go solo. And one thing that happens is Bunsen is super attached to Chris now. From having Chris be at home teaching. Bunsen is like Chris's shadow. He follows her around. He just loves his mummy fave. And when he realized that Chris wasn't going on the walk, he kind of refused to go on the walk. He's like, no, that's okay. So he did his business, and then he stood stubbornly at the opening to the garage door, and he wouldn't move. He wouldn't come for treats. If I tried to pull him, he just dug his feet in. He was not leaving without Chris. So that was cute, but it was also kind of frustrating because Beaker was ready to go for a walk. I think, Adam, you actually scooped up Bunsen, who was right outside the door, so I could take Beaker on a walk. Was that true?
Did, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I opened the door and I was like, oh, Bunsen, what are you doing here? And then I was like, oh, Dad must be right around the corner. I turn the corner, you're gone. You're nowhere to be found.
No, I texted Mom that he wasn't coming, so I figured you guys could scoop him up. And it was fun. It's been a long time since it was just me and Beaker. Like the last time it was just me and Beaker, I think was in the summer when it was way too hot for Bunsen to go on walks. And that's the other time he refuses, is he'll kind of get out of the shade and feel how hot it is. And then he's like, heck no. And then he'll just quit. He'll just go back in the shade and he won't go. So it was really fun having Beaker, seeing her scamper around. She definitely acts way differently without Bunsen. She's not as outgoing. She stays really close to me. So I think having her Bunsen around gives her a little bit of safety feeling. So she can wander a bit more knowing that the big bear is there to protect her. Anyways, it was kind of a cool little thing. That's my story.
Mom, do you have a story?
I sure do. So we've had Raffi and Ellie over, and a cute little photo shoot yesterday with Raffi and Ellie with the new Bunsen 2.0. I'm sorry. I come and sit at the mic, and this is exactly when Bunsen decides to do pet me toddler time. Right, Bunsen? Yep, there he is. It's me. Anyway, that isn't my story. My story is that I had treats in my pocket. And the reason why I brought up Raffi is because, you know, those play sets, like those power drill kind of play sets where you have like plastic, tools and screws and bolts, and it's like super fun. Well, I had one of those plastic bolts in my pocket because I didn't want it to be a choking hazard. So it was in my pocket, and I called Bunsen over and I'm like, hey, come over, Bunsen. And I also had treats in my pocket, and I forgot that I had the bolt in my pocket. And I'm like, here you go. And I put out my hand and it had the bolt on it, and it was like slow-mo. There was treats and the bolt, and Bunsen ate the whole lot. So I'm just waiting for the bolt to be found outside, after the digestive tract has done its business. And then Bunsen has done his business. So it's kind of a gross story, but that's my story.
I did take him on a walk today, and he did poop twice. So maybe that bolt is out there somewhere.
Maybe the bolt is out there. But that's my story. Thank you.
Is Bunsen a shark just eating random objects?
No. Well, he's more of a shark. Beaker's the piranha.
Beaker is a piranha. Bunsen's the bear shark.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was story time. I can't wait to see you guys on the next episode of the podcast. Bye-bye.
That's it for this week's show. Thanks for coming back week after week to listen to us. Special thanks to our expert guest, Dr. Katie Strang, who talked to us about fossilized poop and some awesome other stuff about Scotland. We'd also like to give a special shout out to our top tier patrons on Patreon. Our Patreon page is now called the Paw Pack. If you want to be part of the Paw Pack, head to the links in the show notes, and you can hear your name at the end of the podcast. Take it away, Chris.
Anne Schlarm, Sharon Dotson, Peggy McKeel, Chris Kelly, Samantha Dodd, Debbie Anderson, Courtney Proven, Renee Hardy, Mary Ryder, Shelby Leggett, Mary Coos, Marianne McNally, Karen Beth St. George, Bianca Hyde, Julie Smith, Andrew Lynn, Elizabeth Parmenter, Sandy Breimer, Tracy Halberg, Jenny Giger, Leela Perriello, Lisa Swartz, Catherine Jordan, Donna Craig, Jody Ogren, Liz Button, Kathy Zerker, and Ben Rathert.
For science, empathy, and cuteness.
Home is with you wherever that may